Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Andrew Eck. Andrew is going to lead the conversation for the rest of the hour today. He is the mentor for the apprentices who are going to be speaking today. He's got a background in education as a teacher, and he can describe a little bit more about that. But I've seen Andrew's heart for leading apprentices, helping people to grow. We all kind of have this desire to create more paths to welcome new developers into the field at Launch Scout, and I know there's other companies in the area and around that are doing similar things. And so it's really exciting to just get a chance to experience some of that secondhand through people who are going through the program right now and are nearing the end of it. So Andrew, take it away.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So the basic kind of frame that we're looking at, Sid Workman and David Choi, both of whom are here, have been apprenticing through Launch Scout with the Professional Golf Association of America. And many of those colleagues are also here, which is pretty exciting. We are, I don't have a great sense of time. We're about a month out from the end of the apprenticeship. The way that we structure it is 6 months. Apprentices who are like very early career developers, often folks who are switching careers, come in, work with somebody like me, embedded on a client team for 6 months. And then at the end of that 6 month period, join the client full time. And then I move on to the next thing in most cases. It's pretty exciting. It's one of my favorite things to get to do, and one of my favorite professional projects. And so the framing here, we've got kind of three acts, if we want to do like a dramatic framing, 3 acts. What were you doing before the apprenticeship? What was it like after? And then what was it like during? And then potentially some discussion of like what's next. The questions will be kind of Ruby framed, but not necessarily Ruby specific. And in general, it'll be kind of a fun conversation, I think. As you have questions, so I'll do like open question Q&A at the end. If you've got questions or things that you want noted, drop them in the chat. And then from there, yeah, we'll just rock and roll. Should be a good time. Quick show of hands. So on the bottom of your screen is a reactions button, probably on the bottom of your screen, depending on your Zoom client. If you are a person who is currently working as a software developer, would you mind with the reaction doing like, let's say a heart? So like so. Cool. And this is kind of some intro, initial polling. If you are a person who are working to become a software developer, would you, for your reaction, pick like the clapping hands for the work that you're doing? Cool. Okay, cool. That's and then if you're in a different role, engineering manager, designer, person who just happens to be here for the fun of it, maybe let's say the ta-da confetti. Okay, cool. Got a decent mix, which is exciting. I love it. Okay, so I guess let's start. Let's just start. We can do that rather than finding a graceful segue. Sid and David, would you please start by introducing yourselves just kind of in a general, who am I and what was I doing before I started the apprenticeship? Which of you would like to go first?
I'll go for it.
Yeah, Sid.
All right. Well, not to be repetitive, but my name is Sid. So before I was doing all of this, I was actually not unlike Andrew. I went to school for English education. So I was teaching for a little bit. I liked it a lot, but yeah, there was just some elements of it that were really missing for me. So I stopped teaching, and I was in a very dead-end job of barista at Target that was not getting me anywhere. And so I knew I needed to change careers, and I had a friend in software development that pointed me towards this. And I knew that I couldn't really spend 4 more years in higher education. It was just a long time to wait, and I was ready to get going. So I did some self-teaching for a while, maybe about 6 months of that, and then did a boot camp for another 6 months. And I had actually had my eye on this apprenticeship for probably over a year and a half. But I was waiting until I felt like, I was really ready. And it ended up being, of the many, many things that I applied to, it ended up being the thing that got me here. So it was definitely well worth the wait.
Awesome. Thank you. David, same question.
Yep. Hi, I'm David. Last year, before I became an apprentice, I graduated in May of 2022 with a degree in chemical engineering. Around like my last semester, though, I realized I kind of hated chemical engineering, and the only thing I enjoyed through my curriculum were courses that involved programming in some way, like Intro to C, courses in MATLAB, computing classes. I didn't do much at that point about it, but once I graduated, I dedicated myself to learning by myself for like 3 months, at which point I started applying to, I thought I was ready. So I started applying to like entry-level positions, which didn't go super well. I think I was at like 300 applications for like 5 interviews. LaunchScout being one of them. So then that's where I landed.
Cool. Thank you. To follow up on this, as you were learning, as you were self-teaching, as you were, or I guess Sid, you took that boot camp, what languages were you using? What projects were you doing? Were there resources that you thought were particularly useful? Yeah, I think, what languages were you using initially before we started all of this?
So when I was self-teaching, my aspirations were, I'm going to do front-end development. I was very, very focused in that. So I used a lot of JavaScript and React. Those were really the primary things that I used. And obviously, like, HTML and CSS and some CSS libraries to go, along with that, like Tailwind and Bootstrap, the basics. And in that part of my journey, it was a very hodgepodge approach of, following along, with people on YouTube, just to sort of get a feel for the process, reading, a lot of documentation and just playing around. The bootcamp curriculum that I went through was, it's marketed as a full stack curriculum. I would say it was probably 70% front end, 30% back end. So not a very even split there. But most of it was sort of gearing up to making a quote unquote full stack application of a restaurant reservation app. So, you set up the back end API and the front end that interacted with it. And that was actually the project that I brought to the LaunchScout application.
Cool. David, how about you?
For me, my first language was Python, which was for a couple of reasons. One, I watched like a whole bunch of YouTube videos that were like, if I could code, how would I start from the beginning? And they were like all using Python. The second was, it was pretty similar to MATLAB, and like it seemed to make sense. Honestly, no bias, I probably would start with Ruby if I had to start again, because I feel like I've enjoyed it way more and it makes more sense to me. As far as learning, I concurrently took a few courses at the same time. I took a course on Udemy in Python called 100 Days of Python with Angela Yu. And then I took a JavaScript course called The Complete Guide by Maximilian Schwarzmuller. And then I also took an MIT course on YouTube for, it was like Intro to Algorithms, which I thought worked out really well for me because all those combined gave me like a pretty holistic understanding of the things I felt like I needed to know. And in hindsight, I still feel like that applies. So yeah, as I gained familiarity with these languages, I started building some projects that I had in mind. The first one was like a super simple like Discord bot, because that was the most interesting to me. It was like it used natural language processing to collect all of Shakespeare's plays through an API, and then it created randomly generated phrases using Markov chains, which is also the project I used for my Launch Scout interview. I also started building a web app, but I started working like in the middle of it, so I never got to finish it. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So you've now been with the Professional Golf Association of America for almost 6 months. I guess we're at about 5 months at this point. What language, what tools, what things are you using there?
So at least for me, it's a lot of React and Ruby. And within using Ruby, you know, Ruby on Rails and Active Record and some SQL to maintain the back end. And David, you're doing a little bit extra, right?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the same. Yeah, we use React in the front end, Ruby in the back end. And I've recently picked up Dart and Flutter to work in the native side. So yeah.
So when we started with all of this, if I'm remembering correctly, neither of you had used Ruby before day one, unless you maybe did just a tiny bit like between offer letter and start date. What was your experience of coming into that? And David, I guess you also had not meaningfully used React prior to the start date, if I'm remembering correctly. So what were your experiences, I guess, of learning the new thing, and how did it compare with like other things that you've learned or learning on your own?
I had to break a lot of JavaScript habits because my gut instinct was to do it the JavaScript way, and that is not the way that you program in Ruby. Ruby has a lot of magic going on under the hood. That's very nice. A lot of methods that you wouldn't find in JavaScript. JavaScript, you have to do a lot of just hammering it to make it fit, and you don't really have to do that with Ruby. So that was nice. And yeah.
Nice. David, what was your experience? Go ahead.
I feel like there's a lot of difference in how annoyed I get when I'm working with Ruby versus JavaScript. I'm a big fan of Ruby. At first, it was pretty tough for me. I think the biggest turning point was a really short book called Wise Poignant Guide to Ruby. It doesn't really focus on teaching you Ruby or anything like that. At the beginning, mostly focuses on teaching you how to read Ruby in like complete English sentences, which I feel like is the most important part of Ruby. And I think that was when I really started to enjoy using Ruby and came to appreciate it. We also, the three of us read Pooter. It's practical object-oriented design in Ruby. We didn't finish it. I think we read like half of it, but it was more or less about the principles around object-oriented design while using Ruby as an example. And that also helped. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Ruby, less so JavaScript and React.
That hurts my soul.
That's fair. That's fair. So we, I guess for context, Sid and David did a bunch of studying on their own before I came barreling into their lives, Kool-Aid Man style, or vice versa. And then we spent the first week or two, I think, working together, mostly just getting some of those language fundamentals with Ruby, with Rails, with React. before day one, so before you started, what did you think the job was going to be like?
That was sort of the kicker, is I didn't really know. The reason I wanted the apprenticeship so much was that something I was really lacking in that job search, and that I think was very evident to the people I interviewed with, was that I didn't have the professional experience of working on a development team, being inside of like a large code base, really working, full stack. So I didn't really have expectations. I was just hoping that this would, really put me where I needed to be, and fill in those gaps in my experience, so I could get that feel of, this is how you actually work like a large application.
Yeah. David, what did you think the job was going to be like?
Kind of the same. So I have a lot of peers who are also starting out in the software engineering industry, and they tell me about their work and how they're feeling. And a lot of them seems like are thrown onto the deep end without proper support or mentorship. So I guess that's kind of, I mean, I knew I would have a mentor, but I thought it would be more like that, I guess, a lot less support. And I think I underestimated the importance of having that, because I mean, comparing myself from where I started and where I am now, and what I hear from my peers, I feel like I'm pretty well off. So
Yeah. We're going to come back to that sentiment in a second. A metaphorical second, not a literal second. So let's go forward just a little bit. After we finished that kind of initial just getting oriented, relatively quickly, we started working on a fairly sizable feature, which meant that you had to get into the code base and start being productive. So you're opening up this Ruby code base, Great Whack and React code base, neither of which are small. What are you thinking?
That felt to me like the largest learning curve right there, was how do I move around this massive code base or what felt massive to me, at least, of a language that using a language that I'd like only just started, picking up. And it was very, very helpful the way that, but before we even reached that feature, when we did reach that feature, we were doing, the pair programming with the three of us, and you, Andrew, were doing a lot of the driving, and we got to see, how you navigated, the code base. How do you know what things sort of connect to what, so that we could see it before we had to actually, investigate ourselves.
And I don't think I had a ton of prior exposure to that code base. Maybe a couple of weeks, not enough to get really fluent, but just not a ton. Yeah. David, I guess you had two things that were kind of big and new to you. What were your thoughts? Like the first time that you were getting into that code base, digging around, seeing if you can find the thing that you're looking for.
I can't actively think. In the beginning and now, all I really do is I just Control F the most specific static thing I possibly can, and then that's where I start. So I'm sure like there are different things that make my navigating the code base better, but that's always where I start, and that's the only thing that comes to mind. So yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. A thing that we talk about at Launch Scout when we start a new project, like you're learning the code base. In some cases, you're learning the technology. We will occasionally have clients who are using things that are unfamiliar to us. Like I'd never used Dart or Flutter prior to this project, for example. I don't think I'd ever used GraphQL prior to this project. Both of those were kind of exciting. But then we're also learning the business and the people. What was your experience of learning like the business unit, the business needs that the software team supports, and also the people who are on the team?
My approach was throw myself in there and see what happens. Talk to whoever I can, poke my nose into whatever, projects in business that I can, look into and see what, people are up to. And even though I did try to be proactive, there are still, times where, you sit back and you watch, right? You see, how our projects being handed around between, product design and development teams. How are these two developers, communicating with each other, that sort of thing. So it's a lot of observation, and then also just throwing myself into the water too.
Mm-hmm. And you both had different ways of throwing yourselves in, which was like, not to say one is better than the other, it's different. David, what was your experience?
Yeah, similar to Sid's last part, I took a pretty passive approach, I'd say, to learning that, to the point that it might have become a problem. I relied on like my great mentor and the people surrounding me to pretty much watch and learn the way how they do things, like the soft skills, how to communicate business needs, problems, and solutions, code reviews, being empathetic. And I think I was lucky enough to be surrounded by a whole bunch of people who do all those things super well. And then eventually, I think I became confident enough to try to mimic that. And then, yeah, that's when I started doing those things on my own, I guess.
A thing that was sort of interesting about your journey, David, so the PGA maintains, there's like the feature roadmap, things that we're building out, but then there's also just kind of a list of grab bag items where it's things that need to be fixed but don't necessarily fit into a feature roadmap. And a thing that I remember being surprised by, David, with you specifically, was how maybe a month in, 6 weeks, something like that, you were cruising the grab bag board, finding things and putting up fixes in a way where it was not bad, not a bad surprise at all, a good surprise, but it was surprising to me. And that was a really exciting development. I think Sid, you ended up getting roped into a bunch of like very urgent projects. And David, you went and fixed a bunch of annoying bugs, some of which had been open for like a year. And where there was like this log of like, I tried this and it didn't work, putting it back. Tried this other thing, it didn't work, putting it back. Yeah, very different approaches. But I think the point here that I'm trying to make, particularly for early career or like wanting to transition into software development, is that there are a lot of different ways to be helpful on a team. Okay, so let's talk about, I want to do a little bit of comparing and contrasting here. That's not true. Could you describe to me first, the first big feature that you got to deliver? I think you two were working on different sides of the same project. What was like the first thing that you got to like really deliver where it was bigger than a bug fix?
Probably the page that displays the details of a coach's student. That was like the first big one that we made that hadn't existed prior to then. And that was a fun experience. It was front end and back end, right? We had to build out a functioning query, and then also how do you actually lay out a page from scratch as opposed to just adding something new to what's already there.
And that one too, you were working pretty closely with the designers. You're working really closely with product. I was on my swing of like 3 conferences in 4 weeks or something like that for part of it. So you largely had to function without me. And I recall too, there were a bunch of QA items. There were things that we discovered while building. There were things that layouts that worked really well on screens of a certain size, but then started getting wacky on screens that were much bigger and much smaller. Yeah, that was a cool project. And David, you had a pretty similar one.
Yeah, it was pretty similar to Sid's, and it came after Sid's. So a lot of it was piggybacking off of Sid's work. But yeah, it was the leads page, I think, was the
Yeah,
first
so
big thing. Yeah.
for domain knowledge, this is software that supports a golf coach and their students. Then a lead is somebody who fills out a contact form and says, I'd like to be a golfer. And then the coach can talk to them and figure out if they're going to become a student or if they should go elsewhere, if maybe they should try a different sport. Most of the time, the coach will say, yes, please come be a golfer with me. And that one had some interesting back-end entailments too. I feel like I remember there being a not insignificant amount of back-end work with the like converting a lead to a student. So yeah, how did it feel having like shipped a thing that people are using?
Oh, it was great. I showed my mom immediately.
Nice.
The second it was in production.
Nice.
I mocked up a student and I was like, hey mom, look at this thing that's in use now.
Nice. Nice. How did that feel relative to projects that you had done on your own or things that you had done in school?
I feel like it was only a feature, as opposed to like an entire application or something like that, but it felt more complete, I think, because there was more processes involved. Like you mentioned, getting to do QA, working, with design and product to meet, different needs, and having to pivot, halfway through, as opposed to just like following a very, rigid roadmap of here's this thing you're going to build and here's how you're going to build it. So yeah, it just was a very unique process and felt like a real developer at that point.
Yeah, I really like the process because, you get the Figma designs and like the talk around it, and then you're trying to implement it as closely as possible. And then my personal goal is always like have as few QA items as possible after I'm done creating it. And then I finish it, merge it, and then I get 15 QA items. And then, you're reminded there's still a lot you have to work on and learn. And it's pretty good feedback. So yeah, I really enjoy the whole process.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. There's definitely like a visceral thrill to I made a thing with my brain and now it works. And it didn't before. It feels like a wizard. It's pretty exciting. So you had to put up with me, but you also got to put up with other people who are not me on the PGA team. I'm being a little bit flippant. I was a really big fan of working with the PGA folks. What was the process like? Or what was not even the process? What was the experience like of working within the PGA, of getting to know people, of figuring out what the team's going to be like? Yeah, what was that experience like?
I personally, I really enjoyed pair programming is probably a very generous way of putting the way those talks went. I think it was often just more of a conversation, and I watched somebody else do a thing. But it was great being able to hear other developers' perspectives other than Andrew. Sorry. For the first time, like working with a team of developers instead of just a pair or just myself. I almost want to say Matt, who's on this call right now, might have been the first person that I like actually talk to in a call without Andrew also being there about us trying to solve a problem.
It sounds believable. Yeah, that sounds believable. At least approximately, right?
But yeah, I mean, it was really great because everybody works, you know, a little bit different. David and I have, you know, very different problem solving approaches. Matt and I do, James and I do, you know, just getting to see other people's perspectives and, you know, tap their brain knowledge, that the things that I definitely don't know or but would like to know. Yeah.
Yeah, I really loved being able to pop a question in Slack and then someone random, you had no idea who it would be like, want a pair? I thought that was great. I think the most important thing that all the people I work with have in common, besides proximity and availability, is that I feel like I'm pretty safe and okay with asking them the stupid questions. Because yeah, that's just how it goes sometimes. And I think I'd be comfortable with any of the devs on our team.
And I guess for context, I'm a principal software engineer, and I was completely flummoxed by a GraphQL query, or that earlier this week or late last week. Sent a message to Sid and David, and Sid, I think you were the one who said, "Oh yeah, it's just an alias. Here's how it works," and had a moment of like, "Oh, well, I've misunderstood that for the last several months. What an exciting time." These things happen. It's and they don't stop happening. I think there's a Smash Mouth All-Star lyric about that. But yeah. So moving a little bit forward, thinking about where you are now, thinking about where you were at the start of this apprenticeship or even before, what's the difference? What are some ways that you've grown? What are some ways that you've changed? Yeah, what's the difference?
At least partially confidence. I feel definitely more confident in my my development abilities, but also just in some of those, you know, the soft skills of collaborating, you know, with other people, you know, across teams, something that I had never had to do before. And I mean, and also just sort of a confidence in the team itself. Like I feel in a way I didn't when I was self-teaching, that I have like this network, you know, of support of people that, you know, I can ask questions and learn from, and can continue to, you know, keep growing in a way that I wasn't before. It was sort of, you know, stagnant. And this has been great.
The amount and breadth of tasks that I feel comfortable picking up have really increased from when I first started out. When I was first starting out, I'd spend a whole lot of time perusing the grab bag tickets for something that might be within my ability. I wouldn't even assign them to myself. I'd just like look at them, try it for a bit, and then be like, nope, I can't do that. And these days it feels more like I'm picking the more important things to do, because I feel like I could reasonably do most of the things required. So yeah, I mean, it's a world of difference.
Yeah, and I guess to level set with expectations, particularly for folks who have not yet started working as software developers, my general expectation, and this is a me thing rather than a universal thing, my expectation is that a mid-level developer should be able to deliver most features more or less independently. They'll check in on design, they'll check in on like, I could go this way, I could go that way, I'm not sure which one to pick. Like they'll check in with each other, but they should be able to do things more or less independently. A junior developer should be working towards being able to do all of that more or less independently, but should still be able to take like some of those pieces to deliver. Then the senior developer is the one who's like, these are the patterns, these are the general principles we're using, these are the like the broader architectural decisions that we're making. And so, yeah, so when David talks about like picking the things that are within reach, the whole role of it, the whole job of a junior developer is to expand your reach to where you can deliver most features more or less independently. It's never completely independent, but more or less. Okay, so I think this is maybe the last question that I will have before we kind of open it up to the room. What advice would you give to somebody who is starting to make this journey, or who's like right at the beginning of an apprenticeship or their very first developer job? What advice would you give?
Don't limit yourself. I think a roadblock that I set for myself was I am only going to learn this one language, and I'm only going to do this one thing. And if I can't do it, then oh well. It was very limiting, and being open to learning more languages and more libraries, I think has, only benefited me without a doubt.
Yeah, you were pretty sure you're going to be like front end focused, and now you're very much full stack. And still, because of the work on this particular team, more of your work is still on the front end than on the back end, just as the nature of the business. But yeah, you were pretty sure you're going to be front end focused. It's been fun to see you change that assumption about yourself. David, what piece of advice would you give?
I think I just touched on this, but yeah, I wish that in this environment, I'd have taken on even more challenging tasks, asked for more help, because that's when I ended up learning the most. I was always super scared I'm still scared of breaking something, but that's like what the whole thing is for. And that's why I have such a great support system behind me.
Yeah, I think that's we do a lot as software developers to protect ourselves from our own mistakes. Code review and version control and branching and feature flags and deleting code that doesn't work. We do a lot to protect ourselves from our own mistakes. That's a thing that I didn't have a great sense of very early in my career. And so I spent the first couple of years feeling super like, I need to do this right, otherwise everything's going to blow up. But actually I don't. I can make mistake after mistake after mistake. And it is totally, hopefully they're productive mistakes. But if I am using processes the way that they were designed, the code base is protected, the company is protected, I'm protected. It's pretty cool. But it does take a bit to build that comfort and confidence. I'd like to open it up to the room at large. There might be like a hand raising function. It might just be Google Meets. Anyways, if you've got a question for Sid and David, or for me, we have Chris Nelson here somewhere in the Zoom room. Chris runs the apprenticeship program at Launch Scout at Large. We've got a couple of PGA folks in the room. Yeah, if you've got a question or a thing that you'd like to discuss, we'd love to open the floor to that. Yeah, Leo.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together. It's very informative. So the question that I have is for the people who are currently in the apprenticeship program is, almost every programmer like messes up with the code, or you reach kind of like an impasse where you get like stuck and frustrated. So the question that I have for you is, and you don't have to have the answer, but like, how do you deal with frustration? How do you deal like working with an issue? Maybe you've been working for like a day or two, and you're just giving you a hard time. How do you just come back from that?
I feel like for me, I have two approaches. The first one is I need to just walk away. Sometimes just putting it down and either working on something else or not working on anything for a couple of hours, it'll suddenly, hit me and I'll have an epiphany because I'm not hyper focusing on this like one thing. But otherwise, sometimes all it takes is if you have somebody else that you can bug for a minute and be like, hey, can you come here and can you look at this? Can you give me your perspective? Sometimes you're so overly familiar with like the problem that you're working on that you end up sort of overlooking something that somebody with fresh eyes will notice immediately. And sometimes that thing you're missing is a typo. And that's probably the most frustrating solution of all, but you never noticed it because you looked at it a million times. But yeah, not being afraid to ask for a second opinion or just taking a step back for a while would be my two approaches.
David, what are your thoughts?
I probably differ from Sid. I probably get stuck for too long before I reach out for help because I think it's satisfying when I get to finally solve a problem that I've been working on for a really long time. That's usually because I end up figuring out eventually. But when I do get stuck, I usually like to switch work streams, just work on something different, like in a different part of the code base or a different ticket or something like that, and then just go back and forth. Or ask ChatGPT. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's cool.
What other questions do we have? Yep, I saw a hand somewhere. Coleman.
Yes. Hi. So I have a question for the apprentices as well. When you started I guess getting more like into the company and like I guess more autonomous, did you see that you had any specific routines that you followed? Like, did you always start with back end and then go to front end? Like, did you always I guess even was there a time where in like I guess stand-ups or whatever you would call them, like business wise, would you be specifically asking questions or like find this kind of routine or niche into your everyday life of starting to get more autonomous into PGA?
I'm somebody who likes to ask a lot of questions. Wherever that lies, in the domain of, is there a specific way you want this front end to look? Is there a particular, behavior we're expecting on, the back end? What business problems are we trying, to solve? Is there some weird edge case that we're not thinking of? I ask a lot of questions first. I do still sort of err towards building up some sort of skeleton of something on the front end before moving to the back end, but that's just me. I think it's because it's where I was comfortable first and will probably remain the most comfortable. But yeah, if you want my daily routine, I always start by looking at all of the pull requests that are in the code base to see what everybody's up to and if anybody's looked at my stuff yet. But
our days look pretty different week to week. We're not always assigned big feature work, or sometimes there's just kind of a lull in what we're doing. I have a folder in my Chrome, which is just a big backlog of tasks that I was either interested in, worked on for a bit, and I default to that whenever I don't have a specific task assigned to me. So yeah, I guess as I became more comfortable, my routine was check on the things I finished and if I've gotten any reviews on them. I don't review other people's PRs as much as I should. That's probably where that would fit in as well. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
And thank you for your question. Hagen McPhail is here. He's the engineering manager at PGA and was, Hagen, I'm going to say a nice thing about you and you're just going to have to put up with it for a second. He was really instrumental in making this go as well as it could. There are a lot of ways that hiring a junior developer can go incorrectly. David described earlier with his peers from college of just like getting thrown in the deep end and then you just have to figure it out on your own or you don't, is unfortunately more common than I would prefer. But Hagen did a really great job of making that not the case, and of being a real partner in all of this. And so anyway, all of this is a prelude. One, like a chance to say more nice things about Hagen. But two, if you have, so more questions for the apprentices, awesome. If you have questions for Hagen about the PGA side of things, if you have questions for me or for Chris about the LaunchCat side of things, be happy to take any of those. But if there are more questions for the apprentices, we should do those first.
Andrew, there's one in the chat, I think.
Oh gosh, okay, here we go. How do you do pair programming when remote? I'm more talking about the little interactions when people are together. Great question. Great question. Yeah, I guess Sid, David, and I have never been in the same like 500-mile radius. Might be close to 500. Never in the same like 300-mile radius, much less in the same place. So yeah, what do y'all think?
Well, we definitely relied a lot on live share when it worked, so that we could always sort of be in the same files, you know, working together.
It's a Visual Studio Code plugin for context. But yeah, go ahead.
And I guess sort of what we were working on kind of decided the way those interactions would go. It kind of depended on who was, you know, most comfortable with the task, how much problem solving needed to take place, you know, before then. We would do a lot of, you know, a lot of back and forth discussing, you know, a problem. A fun thing about David and I when we work together is we have two very different approaches to problem solving. I could be wildly off base, but I feel like David likes to do more research about it than I do right off the bat. I'm a let's throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks immediately, and then let that guide me. I think David takes a more like holistic approach and actually looks into something before he tries.
David, did you have thoughts on pair programming remotely?
Not really. I think I mean, when we first started out, we called it pair programming, but it was like 100-0 split, maybe 99-1. But as time went on, I guess that number balanced out little by little. I think the most common type of pair programming that I enjoyed was someone writes the tests and then someone makes that test pass. Yeah.
Yeah, one name for that is ping pong pairing. Yeah, Chris got it in the chat. It's yeah, more concretely, we are still working, frankly, on the mechanics of this. I mean, we're a couple of years into this Zoom-driven world. We are very much still working on the mechanics of it all. A lot of it is get a Zoom call or equivalent up. Somebody's got the editor. If we can do the Visual Studio Code live share, we try. It is not always successful. Yeah, it's a little tricky sometimes. That's okay. It's a little tricky. The next question is from Sarah. How did you both prepare for interviews before you landed the apprenticeship? And then maybe a different, a subsequent question is, what were your interview experiences like, both here and with other things?
For me, in this experience was not unlike what David described earlier. there were a lot of applications for very few interviews.
Mhm.
Like definitely well into the hundreds of applications for a return of like 5 or 6 interviews. And a reoccurring trend that I found was that I could hold that conversation, really well. The soft skills were there of, working as a professional in general, but some of the ability to talk confidently and fluently about code wasn't quite as there as I would have liked. So to that end, I feel like there was more reading that I really could have done to get, the technical jargon down. Algorithms were a very weak point of mine. Those are very hard to keep in my brain, and a lot of companies, they wanted you to have a strong background in algorithms. So if you're going through the application process, definitely worth looking into them. I'm still not convinced that it's something that I'm going to use a lot in my everyday life, but every application seems to want that background. So
For me, I was pretty lucky to have, my brother is a senior software engineer and his wife is a product manager, and they helped give me a lot of insight into the interview process for most companies. They helped me out with my resume. They helped me out with what the different stages of interviews would look like. So that's how I prepared for those, I guess. As far as like coding interviews, I think this is where it's called rubber duck programming applies, where I'd solve like really easy problems, and make sure to articulate my thought process and other important things like that. And I think that's what I ended up doing for Launch Scout. And I think that preparation really helped me, hopefully, land the position, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess for this varies from company to company. The way that Launch Scout does apprenticeship interviews is we'll ask you to submit a project along with the resume. We can look through, and then assuming that your project is real, rather than like a thing that is not real, we'll usually ask you to do an hour or so of pair programming on a feature on a project that you've already started, or if you don't have a project you've already started, we can pick a coding exercise. Then if that, assuming, and the things that we're looking for are, how do you approach solving the problem? How do you talk about the problem that you're solving in the code that you're writing? How do you respond to feedback, and how do you respond to getting stuck? I think of the 4 indicators, at least, that I'm looking for. Chris and I have a lot of overlap, but it's not 100% perfect overlap, because we are different people. And then typically there will be a second interview where we'll ask you to solve like an exorcism ish problem where there's not a ton of like existing business context, but instead it is write a program that, given this set of rules, tells you if the day is like a day off from work, where the set of rules is you don't work on Saturdays and you miss every other Wednesday, and something like that. It's, there's, that one is actually probably more challenging than a lot of the ones that we use. But again, it's just like, how are you approaching these things? Can you work with the base data structures, lists, key value sets, hash maps or dictionaries or whatever you want to call them in language of your choice, integers, strings, things like that. I just want to see that you can work with the core data types with common manipulations. Those are usually the steps that we take. And that seems to align more or less with what I've heard from other companies that do apprenticeships, depending on their volume of candidates and depending on what they're looking for. A little bit more rigor, a little bit less rigor, but that seems to align more or less. And of course it varies. Like as you're looking for junior developer positions, as you're looking for things that require some amount of experience, things will vary, but that's, yeah, that is just what it is. And different companies do it well. I've had when I've looked for jobs in the past, I've had companies give me a take-home assignment that would have taken 40 hours if I were working at full efficiency. And then when I pointed that out, they said, well, how bad do you want the job? The candidate we want will do this work. And well, I did not. So it varies. But Sarah, does that kind of address your question? Cool. Raj asks, I would consider myself to have above average developer skills coming into the apprenticeship, but what would you consider an appropriate level of experience expected from candidates? Chris, this feels like a you question.
Sure. Honestly, though, I feel like we kind of answered it, but maybe not. Really, it's all about like, are you ready for that assessment process that we do, which is we'd like to see some kind of interactive application that you've built, you know, something that works and is real, like you mentioned. And we want to see you be able to work on that application and add a feature to it for about an hour. So for an apprentice, I'm really looking for, can you write code in at least one language, and can you use those skills to successfully actually build some kind of interactive application? So honestly, it's not a lot of like specific skill. I'm certainly not that interested in like specific technologies or frameworks. Those are not really great indicators of a successful apprentice, because it's really more about how you learn and how you progress than what you know on day one. So, you know, it's very subjective, but as an experienced developer, if you spend an hour or so coding with someone, you kind of get a pretty good sense for, this person's going to be a really good developer someday. And I definitely remember that impression with Sid and David. And that's what I'm looking for above everything else. It is fairly subjective, but it's been fairly reliable over the years that I've been doing this. So it's we're looking for potential and aptitude above all as we're selecting apprentices. And that's generally been a really good, you know, it's always amazed me how far people can go in 6 months. And it's really exciting.
We will sometimes see candidates who have some amount of existing professional experience. They've freelanced on a couple of projects that kind of helped with a thing at work. But typically apprenticeship candidates that we see will not have yet worked as professional software developers full-time. Or if they have, it was in like a weird situation or something like that. Usually folks who have already gotten some professional experience working as software developers are looking for like the junior developer job beyond the apprenticeship. Not always, but usually. In the chat, Tim dropped a couple of links to so we have like our apprenticeship that we do. Tim, here, I've got my email address in here as well. And then Maggie Tate is here. She and Bruce Tate run Graxio, which is like education, mentorship, things like that. They're both really great. And so there are links to that in the chat as well. I can't say enough things about Maggie and Bruce. I can say lots of nice things, but it would not be sufficient for all the nice things that I could say. And then, yeah, I think, Hagen, you had a thing you wanted to share or ask.
Yeah, and I was planning on saying this before you said nice things about me, so don't think it's just a rebuttal, but I mean, I'd be remiss not to mention the absolute pleasure of being able to work with Andrew, Doug, Chris, and just the wonderful people at LaunchScout. Their attention to detail, support for our team at the PGA of America, and just the leadership of the apprentices have been beyond exceptional, to say the least. So just wanted to say thanks for that, and just the opportunities that it's afforded us as an organization to move forward with our roadmap and to continue making the progress that we have committed to earlier on in the year. and still bring up to junior developers that are in our platform using our technologies and obtaining our domain knowledge has just been immensely helpful to say the least. So I just wanted to say thanks. And then if anyone has any questions, happy to share my email in the chat after this. If you have questions from a business side or whatever, happy to help answer any of those and provide any insights there.
I think we're, to be respectful of people's time, we're getting close to the end of where we should be on time. Is there anything else, Andrew, that you wanted to cover before we close things out?
Andrew, you're muted.
Finally got myself. Thank you all for being here. I think is the big thing that I'd like to share, and thank you specifically to Sid and David for taking the time to share your experiences. We've got a number of email addresses and whatnot in the chat, which we'd be happy to continue these conversations. I'm also happy to stick around a little bit after, just here in the Zoom room for a bit, and then we can continue if you have other questions. But in the interest of being respectful of everyone's time, if you do need to drop, I mean, you don't need my permission for that, but you're very welcome to yeah, you're welcome to stick around, welcome to drop. But really, thank you all for being here. This is such a treat.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Just in closing, we'll have another Ruby Brigade next month. It'll probably be more technology focused on Ruby. So we won't have a lot more of these just like this, except if we have more apprenticeships, which kind of leads into a different part of this. If you're working with anyone who, if you're hearing the phrase often, like, hey, we can't grow the team fast enough, we only need senior developers, and kind of the closed model thinking of companies who need to grow but don't really know how to get there and don't know how to include new developers in the field into that. Our apprenticeship program works, and there's others that are like us that I kind of mentioned in the chat. They're having good success as well. There's a way to get through this, and if you hear people say that kind of stuff, feel free to pitch any of the apprenticeships that you've heard of, that you've talked about. I'd be happy to jump on a call. I'm sure anybody here would as well. So what we're looking for is opportunities to get more people like Sid and David into the software development industry. And we need people who are running teams and who are writing software that need capacity added to their teams in order to do that. So we're always looking to grow this. There's a whole bunch of stuff in chat. I mentioned Matt Brewer specifically from Engage. Matt, his company also runs an apprenticeship program. If you'd like to know more about that, I dropped a link for the Discord server in there, and I'd be happy to forward you on to him as well. And of course, Maggie and Bruce and all the things that they're doing. So if there's anything, it kind of came fast and furious with all the links and the emails and everything. If you missed any of it and you're worried about that, join the Discord server and you can follow up there and we can recap anything there. And we'll drop links to the video and other resources there. So thank you, everybody. Is there anything that I missed?
I think you dropped this in chat, Tim, but you told me to point this out and I don't want to forget. Yeah. Saturday morning, I think we skipped this month because I had a conflict, but generally Saturday morning, the second Saturday of the month at 10 a.m., we have basically a support group for aspiring developers, people who are trying to become software developers. Meets from 10 to noon generally. We meet both in person at our office downtown Cincinnati, and we also do it remotely over Zoom. So it's kind of a hybrid setup. So we can drop a link to that in the Discord chat is probably the place to do it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop recording. And then if you want to hang out, ask more questions, Andrew said he'd be willing to stick behind. I will too for a few minutes. And so thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a really lovely rest of your week.